Howdy friends, this is PelicanMan bringing you some more Death and Taxes content. Modern Horizons 3 seems to be a big buff for our archetype, though I think the optimal build of our deck will look pretty different to what our list looked like before this set. In this video, I'm going to go over the new cards and my expected new build going forward. Let's start with the new additions from Modern Horizons 3. Recruiter of the Guard is an amazing inclusion from MH3. We finally get a tutor effect like they have in the Legacy build of the deck, so it allows us to slightly change our approach to deck building where we get some powerful silver bullets in the sideboard, some flexibility in the main deck, and if nothing else, just some card advantage, which is something that the modern Death and Tax archetype has been craving for so long. White Orchid Phantom is maybe one of the coolest cards White got out of MH3 overall, but especially great for our archetype. Being a mono white deck, we got to run 8 colorless lands kind of for free. This guy needing double white makes that a little tougher, but because this replaces the copies 5 through out of our Field of Ruin Volatile Fault effect, I think we can go down to just 4 Ghost Quarter, have a much more consistent mana base, and fit this guy in. Very, very strong that it puts the land in tapped, which gives us some tricky plays with Aether Vial, and also is obviously very powerful with flicker effects, letting us reuse our land destruction. Ophelia is a flicker effect like we used to with Ephemerate and Flicker Wisp, but the nice thing is that it's reusable. Obviously it's a downside being on an attack trigger, but I think we can make it work. The plus side is it grows while it's flickering, so it can potentially still survive combat, and it can disrupt the opponent, flickering their blockers away or destroying tokens. And having flash means you can surprise your opponents with it in their end step, so they're not prepared to dealing with it, similar to vialing in a lot of our other threats. Giant in a Kettle Pariah was one of the earliest cards spoiled for MH3, and I was really excited to test it in Death and Taxes. The more I brewed the list with more cards that came out, I ended up cutting it to make room, but then the deck became so flicker focused that I really wanted a Blade Splice type effect, and this at 2 mana seems really, really good for that. It's great to flicker, and it's powerful on both sides of the card. Making a few cat tokens and flipping this over and antheming them all, just continuing to make 2/1s, feels really, really strong to me. But it's worth noting, the requiring a red permanent clause on the 0 ability, I think we can ignore for the most part. We don't need to add red permanents just to make that work. Making a 2/1 every turn is more than sufficient for a 2 mana Planeswalker. When Solitude first got added to the deck, we started running a Miria's Call because it was a land on one side that we could come in untap by paying 3 life, and on the front side, it was a white card to pitch to Solitude. Now we actually get castable spells, so this I find very comparable to a Ganjo Seat of the Empire as a removal spell that also happens to be a land. Similarly, Witch Enchanter, same thing. On the backside, it's a land that we can have come in untapped by paying 3 life, and on the front side, it's a white card to pitch to Solitude, while also being a 4 mana 2/2 that destroys artifacts or enchantments, which is a really nice hate piece to have access to in the main deck for free. But also we can tutor for it with Recruiter of the Guard, so we can tutor for it to pitch to Solitude, but also tutor for a land drop. Flare of Fortitude feels like a card the deck's needed for a while, where it's a great way to protect against sweepers, and it can fight some of the combo win conditions we might see post MH3. And the best part is we have a lot of fodder for it. We have a lot of white creatures that are just going to be left on the battlefield that we're eventually happy to get rid of to pay this cost. Wrath of the Skies is maybe one of the coolest cards to come out of the set. I think especially for us being mono white, there's been times where I wanted an engineered explosive style card, but only being one color, we've never had access to it. This feels like the engineered explosives we needed, especially because we can do it for X or less. It's not just everything with X is destroyed, X or less. So it's a really good sweeper for fast aggressive decks that get under us. We will potentially lose some permanents to it as well, but against decks that overwhelm us on the battlefield, this is a really handy effect to have access to. Monumental Henge is one of the cards I was most excited to see in MH3. We kept seeing cards in this cycle for the other colors, and I was really excited to see the white one. Because we run 8 to 10 basics a lot of the time, this felt like it'd be a pretty free inclusion. It comes untapped pretty often, but it will come in tapped sometimes. But as far as I'm concerned, 4 mana, 5 if you include the fact you have to tap the Henge itself, is a lot, and I think it could be okay if it hits often, but I think a lot of our lists aren't going to have enough targets for it, and also a lot of those targets aren't going to be relevant this late into the game, like Aether Vial, Thalia, even things like Caldra. So I think overall this card to keep in mind, but maybe it's not something we lean into straight away. And now I'd like to go back and look at the existing cards in our archetype and how I think they're impacted by the direction the deck might take post MH3. First off, Aether Vial. I think that this gets even more valuable with our deck becoming more ETB focused. It allows us to disrupt at instant speed with Phantom, so we can get Phantom in their upkeep, destroy their land, the new land comes in tapped, and it's tapped for their entire turn, whereas Sorcery Speed Phantom can't do that. It lets us flash in a Johnny so we can block with a cat token to immediately flip him into a Planeswalker, and it also allows us to reactively play a Recruiter of the Guard to find the exact card we need when the given spot presents itself. Ephemerate was a card we already kind of wanted to run to be able to scam in Solitude, which I think gets even more valuable now that so much of our deck is ETB focused. I think the biggest downside of the scam plan with Solitude was Ephemerate would often rebound and not have any targets, but we have so many cards at 2 and 3 mana that have valuable ETBs to reuse that the rebound's always going to have a target. So I think this is even better now than it already was. Speaking of Solitude, this thing's still as good as it ever was, even better now, because not only can we tutor it with Recruiter of the Guard, we can flicker it with Philia. The Ephemerate's much better, so the scam plan with Ephemerate is more reliable. This card was already one of the best cards in our archetype, and the new build just kind of leans more into what Solitude already wanted us to do. Giver of Runes is another card that might be more important than ever. Being able to play this turn 1, and then turn 2 play a Philia, and Giver of Runes protects it. Giver of Runes protecting a Johnny until it's able to flip. Turn 1 Giver into turn 2 Stoneforge is still really strong, and maybe one of our strongest ways to close out games quickly. I really think 4 Giver of Runes is still where we want to be right now. Stoneforge Mystic is still as powerful as ever. Getting Stoneforge Mystic into Caldra early is still one of our fastest clocks. The issue is that in recent modern, Caldra is not always game ending. With our deck being so flicker focused and ETB focused, this ETB is not super abusable unless you start running more equipment, which I think Stoneforge is still a card I want to be playing initially, but I think it's worth considering that we might be able to replace this lots if stuff like a Johnny gives us a fast enough clock to not rely on Caldra as much. Leonin Arbiter was always one of the mainstays of modern Death and Taxes, not in Legacy, but in modern, because we needed it to upgrade Ghost Quarters into Strip Mines and Path to Exile into Swords to Plowshares and that. But the clash with Stoneforge was always tough when Stoneforge got printed into the modern metagame. I think now with Recruiter, that tension is way, way, way too high. I think it's nice that this combines with Phantom to blow up our opponent's lands, but I also think if mana bases are greedy enough, we can run our opponents out of basic just by flickering Phantom over and over and over again. I expect there might be a pretty low basic counts in people's decks considering how many powerful non-basic lands are getting printed. So time will tell, but I think this is definitely a card that we can look beyond now. I think Leonin Arbiter's time might finally be over. Thalia's another one that I feel like has dropped off in recent years. The tax is nice, but there's too many removal spells that deal with her too cleanly. I think she's still okay, I just don't know how to make room for her. Her and Arbiter are both pretty weak as tutor targets with Recruiter. It's normally too slow by the time they come down, unless specifically you need Thalia for anti-storm. Thalia doesn't have it as the battlefield trigger when our deck's so focused on ETVs, and it makes Ephemerate cost more, and our deck is leaning very hard into Ephemerate right now. Archon of Ymir is a card I've always been low on. I almost didn't include in this list because I forgot it was a relevant card in our archetype. It's probably still fine, not being tutorable hurts, so you'd need to run 3 to 4 copies to be able to run it at all. But this is a card I'm not really qualified to talk on because I've never really liked running it in our archetype, even when it's been its most relevant in modern. Samwise is a card I tested a lot during Lord of the Rings, and it's very interesting in being able to pitch a Solitude, flash into Samwise, rebuy the Solitude. I think it's not as good as I initially thought it was, but I could see still running as a one-off tutor target with Recruiter. It helps fight against removal heavy deck. Flickering it's pretty good at going up in temptation levels with the ring. I think as a one-off tutor target, it's reasonable, but maybe not necessary. Only is a card I have not had much time testing with, but most of our deck now has power 2 or less, so we get double triggers. Most of it has ATVs, which is really good to abuse. Philia's attack is a trigger, so that would also be doubled with Delny. And giving evasion is also really strong. I could see running this as a one-off tutor target to find with Recruiter of the Guard. If you've watched enough of my content, you know I've loved Spirited Companion. I really liked testing with this card in the list initially because of the card advantage, and reusing it with flicker effects like Philia, very, very strong, very synergistic. The one issue is that Orcish Bowmaster is so big in the metagame, and if our opponent's deck has Orcish Bowmasters, we really don't want to be playing Spirited Companion. So if the metagame somehow ends up in a place where Bowmaster is bad or gets banned or something, this is a card I want everyone to keep in their minds. Charming Prince is a fantastic one-of that I think might secretly be the best one-of for our deck in this new meta. We can tutor for it with Recruiter, and it kind of acts as a tutorable Ephemerate if we have an Aether Vial sitting on 2. And the fact that we can scry 2 or gain 3 life if we don't have Flicker synergy yet is really good utility and can help us out in some other matchups like against Burn or against grindy matchups like Control. Similar to Charming Prince, I think a one-off Flicker Wisp is pretty reasonable as a tutor target. Same kind of line if we have a Vial on 3, this kind of acts as an extra copy of Ephemerate. And also worth noting that if we play Witch Blessed Meadow as a land, we can Flicker Wisp that land to have Witch Enchanter come into play and trigger. Since we have Recruiter of the Guard, cards like Containment Priest go up so much in value as just like a sideboard one-off, maybe even main deck in the right metagames. Also, it's really nice that if you have Valia in play and you attack and exile your opponent's creature, they will not return into play under Containment Priest, so kind of a strong little combo there. Unfortunately, it does hurt our Violent Ephemerate plan, but I think in the matchups where we need this effect, it's well worth it. In the same vein, Kataki War's Wage is a huge sideboard card as a one-up to be able to tutor for with Recruiter. The Affinity decks are going to be so all-in, thanks to Ugin's Labyrinth and all the 7-drops, that they're going to have to vomit out a lot of artifacts really quickly, and Kataki is going to be huge in that matchup. Definitely a great one-up to have in our sideboards going forward. Spirit of Labyrinth is another really good sideboard, or maybe even main deck one of that's shootable with Recruiter. It's okay against Yawgmoth, although Bowmasters kills it pretty easily, but if they don't have Bowmasters or Grist to kill it, this is going to stop their combo in its tracks. My main reason for wanting this is because of how good it is at stopping the One Ring. Flagstones of Trocare is maybe the most important land in our mana base now. With White Orchid Phantom, we can use it to blow up our own land, so we can target Flagstones of Trocare. The Phantom will put a Plains into play tapped for us, and the Flagstones will put a Plains into play tapped for us. Worth noting that Phantom gets a basic, while Flagstones gets a Plain, so Flagstones can get you things like Surveil lands, or other utility lands like Shock lands, or Triomes, if that happens to be what you're running. In our deck, probably not, but a one-off Surveil land might be interesting as some value off blowing up our own land, but also just playing a turn 2 Phantom blowing up Flagstones can give us 4 mana on turn 3 to play 2 of our 2-drops because we're so 2-drop heavy, or play a Recruiter and hold up Ephemerate or a line like that, and it also gives us Hardcast Solitude on turn 4 if we don't miss any of our land drops. The one issue with it is that it doesn't work well with the Own Arbiter because if you play a second copy, they will Legend Rule and you won't be able to search with an Arbiter in play, but like I said before, I think we already want to cut Arbiter, which makes this really, really reasonable. The Battle of Bywater is a card that saw a little bit of play in Death and Taxes decks. It looks pretty interesting and pretty weird, but in the new list, there's so many 2 powerless creatures, like really, it's only Flickwisp and maybe Philia if it grows. The main reason I want to consider this is because I think Eldrazi mid-range decks should be on the rise, and if so, I think this is one of our best weapons to fight them. It's a one-sided sweeper, and definitely a card I want to play if Eldrazi happens to be one of the big breakout decks from Modern Horizons 3. Path to Exile looks a little worse if we're thinking about cutting Leon and Arbiter, but the reason we're looking at cutting Arbiter is because I think we can run our opponents out of basic lands pretty quickly. So I think Path to Exile gets pretty good in like all the creature matchups that we might see in MH3. And even if your opponent can get basics off of this, it feeds more into the run them out of basics plan. And if we really need to remove their creature, Path to Exile was always worth running, even though it ramped our opponents. So I think it could be making a pretty big resurgence. I still don't think we run it back in the main, but I think it's definitely a powerful option for our sideboards. Ghost Quarter is still the ideal land destruction land. I think running our opponents out of basics, like I said, our plan I think is going to become, this turns into a strip mine pretty quickly. Our deck sometimes struggles with colorless lands, especially now with White Orchid Phantom, but the nice thing is this can combine with Flagstones of Trocare to turn itself into a white source if we're really desperate. So we've gone from running 8 colorless sources in a 23 land deck to 4, and these 4 can turn into white sources a good percentage of the time. So I think it's pretty free to run, considering this turns into strip mine in a lot of matchups pretty quickly. Iganja was already a card that was free to run the first copy of, and the second copy also basically free, I think. It's not often we would get stuck having 2 of them in hand, having to play both as lands. It feels even stronger now when we've got Ajani and Philia as both strong legends, and considering this helps protect Failure when it wants to get into combat. Iganja Castle also feels like a pretty cute upgrade on a basic plains. If nothing else, protecting Ajani and Philia is actually pretty powerful on a land. It means that Failure can keep getting in with combat and keep triggering itself while not being too worried about dying in combat. I think this is probably a pretty easy one of include in most lists going forward. As for the lands we were running to fill out the slots before, I think most of the lands we no longer want are canopy effects. I think while being really good in the past at helping us negate flooding, now the fact that we've got really castable spells on our lands means we're not worried about flooding anyway, and the fact that we're often blowing up our own flags means we're ripping lands out of our deck, so we're less likely to top deck lands and be stuck drawing poorly, so I don't think we need this effect as much. And I think the life loss is also super relevant if we want to be running lots of the modal double face lands that we have to pay 3 life to come in untapped. And as I mentioned earlier with White Orchid Phantom, I think a need for double white is so important that Volatile Fault, other colorless utility lands have to move to the wayside, which is fine because they're often being used as land destruction, which the White Orchid Phantom replaces itself. So I don't think we're too upset about losing these cards. Now, I'd like to take a look at my first prospective deck list for what I think my Death and Taxes list will look like post MH3. Obviously, this is a first draft, so things are likely to change. As the meta shakes out, we'll see what archetypes rise to the surface, and that will impact our sideboard choices, as well as the specifics of the metagame you're expecting to play in. Even some of those main deck slots might need to be taken up by some of these sideboard shooter targets. I myself have a competitive event 3 days after the release of Modern Horizons 3, so I've done a fair bit of gold fishing with this deck to try and crunch some rough numbers, but I also understand that the card availability and the cards I'm able to get for that tournament might change the final numbers of this deck. Currently, the deck list is 61 cards because I'm struggling to make one last cut. There's a lot of cards competing for the last few slots. I think the easiest cut at this current list would either be the 4th Ajani, the 23rd Land, or the 4th Stoneforge Mystic, as Taboo is cutting the 4th Stoneforge feels like it should be. Also, some of these one-off tutor targets could be moved to the sideboard, but most of them have pretty interesting lines that I really want to have access to in the main deck. There's also a few cards that I really wanted to find room for, but wasn't able to because of how tight this list is. Things like the 4th copy of Philia, the 4th Recruiter of the Guard, and the 1st copy of Flickerwisp are cards I would really have liked to have found room for, but unfortunately this deck list is so congested that they didn't quite make the cut. As I mentioned earlier, I think Stoneforge Mystic might be cuttable. I really think this needs some actual testing and for the metagame to shake out to work out mainly if Ajani is a good enough clock that we don't need to rely on Keldra so much. Obviously Keldra's a little weaker and easier to remove than it was when it first came out, but it's still sometimes a necessary evil for us to have a fast enough clock to close out games. But if that's not the case and Ajani's good enough, I could see trimming the Stoneforge package and having access to all those cards I mentioned. Also worth noting that because Lion Sash is my extra equipment and it's really nice being tutored with Stoneforge and Recruiter, being a white card's pitch to Solitude that you can tutor for with Stoneforge, there's a very good chance that that would still stay in the main deck even if I cut the Stoneforge package. But that's something we need to work out as we get into Modern Horizon 3 and the metagame shakes out and we actually have to test this list. The sideboard might look a little all over the place, but the important thing is we've got a bunch of one-off tutor targets that we can board into that get very strong and essentially become 4 copies to go with our 3 Recruiter of the Guards that when we need them, it might be a little slow sometimes, but we can tutor for them. And even with them being slow, what I kind of aim to do is make sure that post-board, I'm not just relying on 1 Containment Priest for the graveyard decks, I've also got 2 Rest in Peace that I'm bringing in, and a Sanctifier on Vex. So it's the tutor target is very powerful, but it's not coming in by itself, it's coming in with other cards supporting what we're trying to do. With that said, those are my thoughts on Modern Horizons 3 and the future of Death and Taxes, and thank you all so much for listening. I have updated my primer that I've had for a few years now, updated with all this information on Modern Horizons 3, and I've started working on updating the matchup guide as well, so feel free to give that a look. I hope you're all as excited as I am to see our deck grow and transform in this new modern meta. Feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you think about my list, what you think about what Death and Taxes is going to look like, and hopefully I'll be putting out some videos not long after Modern Horizon 3's release, testing this list and maybe testing some different iterations of it. Until then, bye-zy.